Whoever has not been or is not a good master of the figure, and most of all of anatomy, cannot understand anything of it. In the winter of 1494, in the hospital of Santo Spirito in Florence, the 19-year-old Michelangelo dissected his first corpse. For the rest of his life, dissection was to provide him with the vital source material for his art and his imagination. This grisly, stinking, insanitary, unrefrigerated, unhygienic and dangerous practice gave him, so it was said by Condivi, his biographer, the greatest possible pleasure. Michelangelo and Leonardo are the only two artists that we know who regularly dissected corpses. For Leonardo, dissection was a preparation for a science of the body. The ancient Greeks believed that the human body was a form created in perfect harmony that could be symbolized mathematically. Numbers and geometry established the rules of classical proportion that were followed by all artists up to the 19th century. Michelangelo's organic conception of the human body was unique and revolutionary. He was seeking a unity in the functioning of the brain, the nerves, muscles and respiratory systems, as well as in gestures and movement that did not depend on numbers. Proportion for him was in the mind's eye. The marble relief of the Battle of the Centaurs, executed in 1492 by the 17-year-old Michelangelo, 2 years before he began dissection, belongs still to the world of the 15th century. In comparison, the marble David of 1502 could be by another sculptor. The anatomy is now full of closely observed, accurate, even hyper-realist detail. This is a work that transcends its epoch and belongs to eternity. From the moment Michelangelo begins cutting into bodies, his sculpture takes on a new grandeur of conception. The anatomy of his figures becomes detailed, accurate and expressive, and their faces betray a troubled interior life. With his knowledge of the workings of the body as his vocabulary, Michelangelo uses the male torso to create a sublime visual poetry. The Michelangelo bronze sculptures of nude men riding panthers from the Rothschild collection have been dated to the years 1506-1508, years that were among the most creative in the sculptor's life. Professor Peter Abrahams, the eminent clinical anatomist, will now discuss the anatomy of these two extraordinary bronze figures.
When I first saw these bronzes, I was completely gobsmacked when it was told to me that they were from the early part of the 1500s. When I looked at them at first, I thought that these were probably end of the 16th century, possibly even later than that. When I was told that these had been produced before any record of any scientific works of anatomy had ever been produced anywhere in the world, I was quite shocked. There is an uncanny accuracy in the anatomy in detail, but not only is it anatomy, but these bronzes are hyper-anatomized to show the beauty of the human body. And looking at some of the detail, as I will show you in this short film, of things like the sartorius groove, the triangle of auscultation, the contraction of gastric nemesis, there are effectively only two people at the beginning of the 1500s who could possibly have had the knowledge base, anatomically speaking, to perform these sculptures. And they are Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. First of all, we have a huge deltoid. We can see the anterior border of the axilla, which is the pectoralis major coming across, and we can see the teres major coming into the posterior wall of the axilla. If we look at the upper arm, we can see here a very well developed biceps and of course the triceps, and here is the medial epicondyle of the elbow. When we move to the forearm, this gentleman has a very well developed flexor group because he's flexing his wrist, and we can see the flexors of the fingers and the flexors of the wrist are very well developed here. And if we look just here, we can see the tendon of flexor carpi ulnaris, and here the tendon of flexor carpi radialis, because he has both his fingers and his wrist slightly flexed. Here is the pectoralis major in the anterior wall of the axilla. Here is the teres major in the posterior wall of the axilla. There is the biceps on the anterior surface of the raised arm and the triceps on the posterior surface. There's the reference point of the medial epicondyle, and here is the very well developed flexors of the forearm with the tendon of flexor carpi ulnaris beautifully shown there. And if we move over here, we can see the tendon of flexor carpi radialis. There we are, we can see pectoralis major with its little interdigitations. As we go down the abdomen, if you can lean back a little bit, you can see here is the linea alba, very pronounced on this gentleman, and his six-pack, but not only a six-pack, but if we look down at the lower abdomen, I can feel here a tendinous intersection which makes him one of the 20% of people that have an 8-pack arrangement of the abdominal muscle called rectus abdominis. As we go down the linea alba, here is the umbilicus, and you can see on Ilmar here a obvious little hood of skin over the umbilicus. As we come down the midline, we can see the pectoralis major with its little interdigitations, something that Michelangelo particularly often showed in his drawings. And as we come down the midline to the umbilicus, you can see the little hood here on the umbilicus, just a little hood of skin over the top, and a very deep groove in the rectus abdominis linea alba. And in this particular person, you can see there is actually an 8-pack with a tendinous intersection in the lower abdomen between the umbilicus and the pubis area. And that's true of about 20% of normal individuals. You can also see beautifully shown the linea semilunaris, which is the lateral border of the rectus abdominis muscle. The other feature that's often shown also is this muscle here is the transversus abdominis muscle coming in each side of the lower abdomen and going to form part of the rectus sheath. So we're here now on the left arm, and we can see obviously a huge deltoid, a very obvious biceps with veins running across it. Here in fact we've got the cephalic vein. Here is the biceps. Here medially is the medial epicondyle, but what you can see beautifully is the cubital fossa, and in the cubital fossa we have a basilic vein and a cephalic vein, and they go up the arm, one on the medial, one on the lateral side. But this little hollow is then swamped by this huge massive muscle, most of which is brachioradialis, and some of which is the flexors of the fingers, as he has got his fingers flexed. And you can see a little swelling here, and that little swelling, which is overemphasized on the bronze, is in fact the abductors of the thumb and the extensors and abductors of the thumb, which are going down to here. Here is the huge swelling of brachioradialis, and here is an extra little swelling for the abductors of the thumb, which is down here. I think that is hyperanatomy. I think it would be impossible to have such huge swelling there for those muscles, though this brachioradialis is often huge in people that are using their hand in manual labor. So when we look at the pubic hair in this bronze, you can see that it is sort of backcombed and blow-dried in very nice wavy coiffure distribution, and more importantly it is distributed going up towards the umbilicus and not, as in most statues of the period, in the antiquity design, which is cut off at the top with an inverted triangle here. It should be a triangle going up towards the umbilicus, as incidentally happens in Michelangelo's David, has a very similar distribution going up towards the umbilicus. If we now look down below the knee, you will see there is a flaccid, soft gastrocnemius, and underneath that a soleus muscle. If we go over to the bronze, you will see, as we have been talking about it, and there is one interesting point, that the gastrocnemius, which is this muscle, is in fact contracted, and if I feel here, I can feel the two heads of gastrocnemius. Now that is wrong. Not only is he showing the anatomy of a bulging muscle, which cannot bulge and contract in that position, but he's showing it with its two separate heads. And when we look at the model, or any person with a flexed knee, you cannot contract the heads of gastrocnemius. The soleus, this muscle here, is beautifully correctly shown in this position, but the modeler has cheated on the gastrocnemius because he's seen them at dissection as having two heads, and he's want to show them as this hyperanatomy of the human. So if we look at the feet of this bronze, you will note that it has the classical Greek ideal with the second toe longer than the first toe, and in this particular case, and on both feet, we can see there is quite a big gap between the first and second toe. Now if you look at all of Michelangelo's work, you will note, particularly if you look at the drawings for the Libyan Sibyl for the Sistine Chapel, that there is exactly the same arrangement of a slightly deviated second long toe, and that is a small proportion of the human population who have that, but it seems to appear in all of his work, including Moses and Michelangelo's David. Well, if we now look at the back of our model here, we can see a well-developed deltoid. We can see the top of trapezius, and here is the huge trapezoid-shaped muscle on Ilmar here, with a huge hollow at the point of the neck. You can notice that because the right arm is lifted up in the air, we have a rotation of the scapula, and his scapula is rotating outwards and upwards to allow the movement to abduct his arm. And as we look down here, we have a deep hollow because he's a very well-developed model with the erector spinae on each side. And if we can contract here, we can see erector spinae, and these two little hollows are the posterior superior iliac spine, which are well pronounced on someone who's got a lot of built-up muscles. But I want you to look in this area, and there is no obvious triangle in this area. However, when we move over to the model, you can see the deltoid, you can see trapezius, here is the trapezius, you can see the rotated shoulder blade, the rotated scapula, you can see the erector spinae muscles going up and down the back, and here is the gluteus just at the end. But what is noticeable is on both sides is a little triangle. Now interestingly, to know there was a little triangle would have taken dissection. You can't see it on the living model, but you can see it at dissection, and it's an area that medically we call the triangle of auscultation, and it is the border of latissimus dorsi muscle, the scapula and trapezius muscle, and there is no muscle in that little hollow, but it is something you can see very easily at dissection, which is another reason why, including the groove sartorius, including the gastrocnemius, including the 8-pack on the rectus abdominis, I am certain that the person that modelled these statues had experience of dissecting the human body.
Michelangelo's literal penetration of the human body to understand its workings was the key to his figurative penetration of the psyche. His study of anatomy, movement and gesture led to a shift from an objective to a subjective approach to reality. This giant leap forward of the imagination outpaced the tide of history and was not to find its full expression until the 19th century. Michelangelo's sculpture, painting, drawing and architecture are conceived as metaphors of the human figure alive in space and in movement, and are without comparison in the history of art.